Bom dia, good afternoon. Welcome to another segment of the literature of the Mediterranean diet during our week-long celebration of San Jordi, New York City 2021, organized and supported by the Farragut Fund for Catalan Culture in the US and its director, Daniel Newman. My name is Rosi Song, and I hold a chair in Hispanic Studies at Durham University, and I'm delighted to share today's program with my colleague, Daniel Newman, who has recently translated and published a fascinating cookbook from Egypt from the 15th century, which we will be talking about today. Daniel Newman holds a chair of Arabic Studies at the University of Durham, and his publications include An Imam in Paris, account of a stay in France by an Egyptian cleric, the Sultan's Feast, the book that we're gonna talk about today, and also the Sultan's Sex Potions, Arab Aphrodisiacs in the Middle Ages, and also a collection of modern Arabic short stories, among many other publications. So welcome, Daniel. Thank you so much for being here today. And I have to start by saying that you and I, Daniel, despite being colleagues, have not yet personally met due to the pandemic, right? So I had just joined Durham when we all went into lockdown, and pretty much since then, we have been living in a virtual world. So hello, and nice to meet you in this setting. And how have you been?
Thank you. Well, hello to you too, Rosie. And it's so exciting to actually. I think this has never happened before. That a colleague and I are collaborating on something literally without having met. And as you say, you arrived in Durham while I was away, and then the pandemic meant that everybody was away. So, but it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you so much, and congratulations again on this magnificent book. We will show the cover when we talk about the later parts of the book. But before we get to that part, I thought that maybe you can tell us a little bit about this cookbook, about the author and his history, and we'll sort of go building into sort of the context and the content of this book before we get sort of to the meaty part of it, which probably are the recipes. Yes. So
Yeah.
yes, let's start with that. So this Egyptian cookbook and this author, what's the story behind this book?
Well, it's a very interesting story in many ways. To begin with, it's a very late cookery book. It's one of the last, possibly the last Arabic cookery book of the Middle Ages. And of course, there are a number of reasons for that, but they don't explain everything. The reasons, of course, for instance, being that for a start, Al-Andalus by that time had been regained by the Christians. There was a general decline in the various Arab empires. And of course, there was the rise of the Ottoman Empire. And the Ottoman Empire meant that the balance of power, the center of power, rather, moved northward, of course, outside the Arabic-speaking sphere to Istanbul. And so from the 15th century onwards, there are no more cookery books until, Arabic cookery books, of course, should hasten that, until the 19th century. So the 19th century, so in between the 15th and 19th century, we really don't have any, or they haven't been found, because no doubt there are some lurking somewhere in libraries. And I've been fortunate, in fact, to find one of those lurking in the course of my research for the Sultan's Feast. So I'm very excited about that. Now, we turn to the author. And so his name, Ibn Mubarak Shah, or his full name, Shihab bin Ahmed bin Muhammad bin Hussein bin Ibrahim bin Sulaiman al-Masri.
Okay.
And it's not finished yet. Al-Hanafi al-Sufi.
He,
as the name, Yeah, as the name indicates. So we have a couple of clues here. So El Masri, he was also known as El Qahiri,
Mm.
refers to the fact that he was Egyptian. And then we have El Hanafi, which refers to a school of religious law. So it tells us that he was a legal scholar. And the Sufi, of course, tells us that he was probably also a Sufi. Born in the early 15th century and died around the middle of that century. And unfortunately, he is a bit of a mystery. Chroniclers of the time and those that came shortly afterwards clearly speak of him in glowing terms. The problem is they don't talk about him very much and they don't have a lot to say about him. And like so many of the educated elite of his day, he was what today we would probably call a Renaissance man. He was a poet, he was in various kinds of art, he was interested in the sciences, and so on and so forth. He was a member of a select group, a little cabal of poets known as the Seven Shooting Stars. And the shooting stars here is in reference to the fact that all of them had the honorific Shihab-ed-Din, which means the shooting star of the faith. Mm. And when we turn to Ibn Mubarak Shah, his sole lasting output, in fact, is not a work of creativity, but it is, in fact, an anthology of poetry. It's a huge monumental work. The manuscript, which apparently is an autograph, so written by Ibn Mubarak Shah, is currently held in Istanbul and hasn't been edited. Mm. Now, this collection of poems is quite significant because Ibn Mubarak Shah has preserved poems, and here I can already introduce a little Andalusian connection. Among them, for instance, poems by the great Ibn Quzman, the great Andalusi poet of the 12th century. And so a lot of these poems were preserved by Ibn Mubarak Shah and can't be found anywhere else. So historically, the work is actually of quite some significance. The next question, so in terms of his life, that's about all we know really, or that we can reliably report. The next question, of course, is now his life in relation to the cookery book. So was he also a chef? Is the first question I think that people might ask themselves. Why did he compile the book? Now, first of all, the book isn't an original work in any sense, because most of it is, of course, borrowed, or to be more precise, adapted from earlier works. But there are some recipes that can't be found anywhere else, which may or may not have been the author's own invention. Now, there are some clues as to how we can reply to those questions in the text. And if we put all the bits together, we can come up with what I think is a fairly reliable hypothesis, which is that rather than being a chef, Ibn Mubarak Shah was an amateur gastronome who started compiling recipes of his favorite dishes in order for them to be prepared in the household. And so, for instance, I don't know whether you remember, he mentions the fact that some of his maidservants made this or that dish, or for certain ingredients, don't bother making it yourself, just go to the market and buy it ready-made. So very practical information. And so unlike the cookbooks of earlier centuries, particularly the 10th and 13th centuries, which were really about a cuisine of nobility and the royal court, here we have a cookbook, a recipe book, compiled by the head of what we could call, for want of a better term, a middle-class household.
Yeah. Mm.
And of course, in that sense, it has an important added historical dimension. For instance, it tells us which dishes survived from earlier times. which dishes, which recipes didn't survive, recipes that were introduced and had not been described in earlier cookbooks. And among the new arrivals, of course, we have some Turkish dishes, and they're easily identified, of course, by their name. So in a way, you're getting a snapshot. You're witnessing the changing power balance, the changing political landscape in the Mediterranean. And
Really,
also, I think I have to say that it's no coincidence that the man who wrote a poetry anthology also wrote what is in effect a culinary anthology. And his poetic inclination comes out in the title, which is very flowery. زهر الحديقة في الأطعمة الأنيقة. So the flowers in the garden of elegant foods, which is a very elegant, very flowery way to describe the book. The other interesting thing is that many of the earlier cookery books have endured in a number of manuscripts. This one, again, as far as is known, has survived in only one manuscript.
wow.
So there's only one version of the book, which is held at the Gotha Library, and that's the text that we've used. Now, the manuscript, unfortunately, isn't dated, and so I can't really tell you very much regarding its provenance. If I analyze the hand, so the actual script, it's an Eastern script, so it was probably made in the East, or definitely not in the Maghreb. That's one thing. And it was a copy that was made by somebody other than the author, because there is a reference to the fact that the author has died. So it's a copy that was made after Ibn Mubarak Shah's death. So that's about it, really, regarding the author and the text, the manuscript.
But I think there's a lot of story already that you're telling of this book. So what drew you to this project? I mean, you said that you found this document, and how did you think about, okay, I'm gonna go and translate and edit and publish it, or yeah, so tell us a little bit about your own connection with this project.
Well, it's been an amazing journey, and it actually goes back to quite a number of years, and it's linked to my interest and research into medieval Islamic medicine, and particularly in the field of aphrodisiacs, and that found its way into the book that you've already mentioned, the Sultan's sex potions. And now you can't really research something like this without coming to contact with food, because of course medicine, and we are now in the Galenic system, and I don't need to tell you anything about that. So food, of course, is medicine. It's food as medicine, and then sometimes medicine as food. There's some medical preparations, sweets in particular, for instance, that were primarily made for medicinal reasons, but that people nevertheless enjoyed by themselves. But so food really is at the heart of this. And so when I was researching the aphrodisiacs, I also, in the course of my research, consulted these culinary treatises. And so at the time, not all of them had been edited even, and so some were available only in manuscript, among them the book by Ibn Mubarak Shah. And so, excuse me, as I delved deeper into these culinary treatises, it's something that really began to enthuse me. And of course, the fact that Ibn Mubarak Shah's book wasn't edited, well, it was edited much later, but in a very poor edition. It struck me that it would be appropriate for me to edit and translate a book which in addition, hadn't really received a lot of attention from scholars. In the meantime, so from the 1980s, I would say, the kind of proliferation of interest in food studies meant that medieval Arab food was also researched by a small number of people. But the focus was particularly on the kind of bigger and collections. So that's why I decided it would be a good idea to edit and translate this one. And then, of course, there was the kind of the joy of recreating these dishes, which came very soon after. But I think we're going to talk about that a bit later.
Sorry about that. For some reason, my phone is ringing at this point. I turned it off, but such is life. So actually, I wanted to ask you, so what did you enjoy the most about this project, and what you found it most challenging as well?
It's difficult to say. I think what I enjoyed most is really getting to know more about medieval Arab culture through researching the culinary tradition, and particularly, and here we come full circle, the cookery books have now taken me back, or the culinary tradition rather, has taken me back to where I started, i.e. the medical tradition, more particularly pharmacology.
Mm.
And there are a number of pharmacological works that also contain recipes for dishes. And this is where it becomes really interesting. And I shan't bore you with that, but just a little taster. When they talk about the nature of various spices and plants and so on, it's hot, cold, moist, that kind of thing, the humors and so on. What is very interesting is that this system was also expanded to include dishes, which of course is very complex because you're including sometimes 10, 15 ingredients. How does this work? How are the humoral properties of the constituent components extrapolated towards the dish as a whole? There's very interesting material there, and really worthy of research. And then, of course, there is the enjoyment of the recreation of the dishes. Of course, has been a wonderful thing as well.
And we'll talk about that a little bit later. So, speaking about these pharmacology, right, related to food, there's also another topic that you talk about, which is magic and food, right? So, what is this relationship between magic, food, drugs, food, but also religion and food, right? So there are all these ways in which food connects, right, to different parts of life. And I was wondering, what do you think, or what connections such as this one survive until today? Or how would a contemporary reader of these kind of cookbooks sort of find interesting or sort of relevant still to his or her own experience of food and relationship with food?
Yeah, that's a very good question. And of course, the Islam, but in fact, the three kind of monotheistic religions have numerous dietary recommendations, prohibitions, laws, and so on. And I'm sure it's well known that in Islam, one isn't supposed to eat pork or carrion or wine, although we'll get back to that later as well. But of course, food is linked to religious feasts. And the most important one, I would say, is, of course, Ramadan, where at the end of each day, when the believers break the fast, they have a big meal, the iftar. And this today is connected with various types of dishes and food, predominantly meat, but also sweets. And so, of course, then there's the feast of the sacrifice, the Eid, where people will, both in Mecca, the place of the pilgrimage, and elsewhere, slaughter a sheep, of course, and eat lamb. Now, it's also related to personal feasts like weddings. And in fact, there's a religious injunction that one is supposed to hold a feast, as I think is quite nice. That actually religion tells you that, you know, you should really celebrate that.
Right, right.
And also religion tells you, hadith, so sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, also tell you that one should never decline a wedding invitation. Whether or not that should be taken literally, I don't know. I'm sure we all have weddings that we wish we would have declined, but that's that's for another day. Now, in terms of the connection, and this is, I mean, every time I go to these sources, you know, I'm surprised by, or my eye is caught by something new. So, for instance, it's very interesting, to me at least, that religion is rarely mentioned in the cookery books. You would imagine that there's numerous references to indeed these religious festivals, and we're going to have this meal, and we're going to prepare these ingredients, and so on. And in fact, in the whole corpus, the only feast that's mentioned is Ramadan. And there's only one recipe in an Egyptian cookery book, and that's a very mundane one, kind of a barley drink. And there's one in an Andalusian manual from the 13th century. And this Andalusian dish is one that involves, it's kind of like a bread sop. So it's crumbled bread on which you have a broth with vegetables and meat. So these are the two dishes where Ramadan is mentioned, as in this is a good dish to have during Ramadan. That's it. Now, of course, you may ask yourself, well, this is really odd. On the other hand, you could argue that there would have been no need for authors to mention a specific link with a feast, because people would have known, but simply to provide recipes for the dishes that people would have eaten. So it's perhaps less surprising than it appears at first sight. When it comes to religion and food, there's another very interesting bit. Now, this was very much, the Mediterranean was a very multi-confessional area, very multi-confessional space, within which, of course, Muslims, Christians, and Jews cohabited from Al-Andalus all the way up to Iraq, or what is today Iraq. And so the next question is, are there any Christian dishes? And indeed there are. And there are some references to Christian dishes, which ironically, many of them are known as counterfeit, in Arabic, muzawwara, counterfeit dishes, because they they try to imitate dishes made with meat. And these counterfeit dishes for Christians, so they were either for Christians or for sick people, for weaklings. But because meat was so important, the only way they thought that they could make the sick person eat the dish that was good for him, they would make it look as if there was meat in it. Hence a counterfeit dish. So there's quite a few there. In Al-Andalus as well, for instance, there are references to the fact that certain religions, Christians, like particular spices and so on, but very minimal. When it comes to the Jews, there it becomes even more bizarre, in that there are hardly any references. In fact, there are only two references in the whole corpus. One is a recipe from the East, a very mysterious recipe. It's known in one manuscript as Jewish meatballs, but in another manuscript, the same text, the meatballs cursed by Jews. Clearly, there were very strong feelings about this dish. And then in Al-Andalus, that's the biggest source, there you have about 6 dishes which are all called Jewish dishes. And of course, the question that anybody reading that for the first time asks is, of course, what is Jewish about these dishes? And the answer, I'm afraid to disappoint you, nothing, as far as I can tell. So it's a real mystery. Over the years, several people have tried to come up with theories, but I don't think any really stand up to scrutiny, because if we look at the ingredients, there's nothing peculiarly Jewish about them. We look at the preparation, nothing peculiarly Jewish
Mhm.
about that either.
So since we're talking about this naming of dishes, maybe we can touch a little bit on some of the things that you write about in the introduction of the book, which is about etymologies, right? About sort of the history of words. And one of the words that caught my attention was actually, and you already mentioned, was wine. Can you tell us a little bit about that word in the context of the cookbook?
Yeah. Well, wine is an interesting thing. Of course, in Islam, intoxicating drinks are not allowed, and that, of course, includes wine. On the other hand, wine vinegar was by far the most used vinegar, but of course, it's not subject to fermentation.
Mm.
They had other drinks that were fermented, but uh, not up to the intoxicating point. But as you can imagine, this gave rise to a lot of discussion amongst legal scholars. The interesting thing about wine, actually, is, well, there are a few recipes in the cookery books that actually require wine, and at the banquets, people definitely drank wine. That has to be said. There's even a very prolific genre in medieval Arabic literature known as wine poetry. But let's return to the word wine and why it's so interesting. It's, of course, the link between wine and coffee, because the modern word in Arabic for coffee is qahwa, and you can clearly hear,
Mm.
qahwa, cafe, and so on. You can clearly hear the origin. Originally was a word for wine, and it's attested in very old poetry already.
Mm.
And so when wine was introduced in the Yemen in the 14th century, this word, qahwa, was then transferred to the new beverage
Mm.
on the basis that they were similar in color and in some ways, of course, similar in taste as well, a certain bitterness. And the
Mm.
color, of course, you have to imagine that in those days, the wine did not look the way that it does today. So it was a lot darker, it was a lot stronger. As you know, it had to be diluted with water. So we have a word that meant wine that eventually ended up meaning coffee.
That is really fascinating. And since we are talking about food products at this point, I think that before we show our viewers some of the recipes that you've been blogging about and making, can you read us a sample recipe from this manuscript? And I think we talked about something that might be
Yes.
really interesting.
Well, I can perhaps read a recipe for an omelet, uh, which has some interesting properties. And it's a recipe in the book, it's number 111, and it's an omelet for increasing sexual potency. And it goes as follows. Take 4 onions and cook them in the oven until they're done. Peel and pound them very finely. Also take half a rattle. Rattle is, let's say, half a pound. So one rattle is a pound, so half a rattle, half a pound of meat that has already been boiled. And after removing the broth, fry it until it is done.
Mm.
Pound the meat and add it to the cooked onions with what remains of the broth. Break 20 chicken egg yolks, 20, into the pot and beat everything. Then add the aforementioned spices to bring out their flavors, as well as a little salt. Fry in sesame oil or clarified butter, ghee for most people
Mhm.
today, and add to the pounded onions and meat as described. So here we have a good example of uh, food dishes, cooked dishes being used as medicine. And actually, if we look at the cookery books, not all of them contain medical information, but
Mm.
those that do, there will generally be a recipe that is intended to increase potency.
Yes. And I
So
think
this is one of them.
Yeah, and also linked to magic as well, I think, there's the idea of, right, potency and so on. So, uh,
Absolutely.
so I think that 20 eggs, and I'm not gonna ask if this is one of the recipes that you tried, but let's go and share the screen and shows our viewers the book. Sorry, let me just go quickly into the presentation mode. So this is the book, The Sultan's Feast. It has this lovely cover, and I just put there the address of the publisher that our viewers can go check out and order, hopefully. And this is actually the blog that you've been maintaining about this cookbook. And here's the address. And I thought that we could go quickly, a selection of things that you have written about and cooked. So I thought that we could start very quickly with something that we identify with actually Spain, the southern part of Spain, actually, which are the sour oranges. And this is this beautiful painting. I don't know how to describe this actually. Maybe you can tell us a little bit, and what's the place that sour oranges have in that cooking in that time.
Yeah. This is actually a drawing from a manuscript, so a kind of a representation of the sour orange tree. In fact, when we talk about the ingredients, when translating or when recreating, these compose particular problems, because obviously an ingredient that was around in 10th century Baghdad isn't necessarily the same ingredient that we buy at Sainsbury's. And to that, of course, you have to add the terminology, which is often quite confusing. So there's a lot of research that goes into trying at least to find the ingredient that would have been used by the cooks in those days. And here we have a good example, which is the sour orange. And of course, it's interesting for a number of reasons. So here, for instance, say if you want to recreate a dish, and there were quite a few with the naranj, of course, you can't use the oranges that we buy today, which are also known, of course, as Seville oranges. Mm. Now, the fruit came probably from the East, and in cooking, it was used mainly in stews known as naranjilla. So you see there, naranj is the Arabic word, naranjilla is a naranj stew. But the peel was also sometimes used, particularly in perfumes and aromatic powders. And in the Sultan's Feast, there is an interesting example of the leaves that were used. And there's a recipe for a halloum cheese, which is preserved with orange leaves and milk. So as you can imagine, again, a taste that you would probably encounter today.
So
actually, when we talk about the use,
yeah, you said that naranj means stew.
No, naranjilla is a stew made with naranj.
Okay, sorry. I was like, well, I didn't, because in Spanish, right? The word is naranja, so I was just curious.
Exactly.
Sorry.
And of course, the sweet orange that we have today, of course, that was imported much later on. Yes. So yeah. This is a very different. It's a bit like the difference between lemon and citron. Right. Now, when it comes to cooking or the use of the naranj and the sour orange in the cookery books, we again have an interesting picture in that although it was cultivated widely very early on, it's interesting that it's found mainly in the Eastern cookbooks. So the ones produced, so when I say East, I mean Egypt, the Levant, the Middle East, if you like. And so there are a couple in in the Sultan's feast, for instance. There's of course a sour orange stew, and it's used particularly because of its sourness. And you can tell that many of the dishes that require the sour orange also include lemons and citrons. And um, you've read the book, you find that one kind of thread that goes through the recipes is clearly a love of things that are sour, hence the use of vinegar in so many recipes, and the use of lemon, citron, and so on. What is significant is that in Andalusian treatises, the sour orange is not used at all. And as I said, there is evidence that it, of course, was cultivated at that time. So it's very interesting. Neither of the Western treatises, cookery books, have recipes that require the sour orange. The only reference is to biscuits that the cook has to shape like a sour orange. That's the only, yeah, isn't it just? And so it's interesting that the place where the word itself, it's naranja. So Spanish is has preserved the form that most closely resembles the Arabic word. That it's there, that it's absent from the cookery books. Of course, and a final part of the orange story is that the Iberian Peninsula returned the favor to the Arabs by, of course, exporting the sweet orange much later, courtesy of the Portuguese traders. And in Arabic, this Portuguese connection is still present in the word Portugal, where you can clearly hear Portugal, which is the Arabic word for orange.
Oh, that's
give and take, movement across the Mediterranean. It's a fascinating story.
Yes. And also, I was just thinking about the medieval cookbooks, the Catalonian medieval cookbooks, and they use a lot of these acidic, right? So they use verjuice that they call it, or at least
Yes,
translation into English of the senso vi, for example. Yes. So, wow.
yes, I was going to say the senso vi is a good example because you have some interesting similarities in terms of ingredients and dishes. And let's not forget, sometimes language really gives you an insight into cookery practice. And again, I can take Spanish as an example. Albondigas in Spanish, meatballs. Now, this comes from an Arabic word, bunduk, which is hazelnut. So, because they don't tell you how big the meatballs have to be, you can deduce, of course, that since the word eventually came to mean meatballs, the meatballs that they would have used would have been the very small ones, almost the size of hazelnuts, that they would have preferred small meatballs rather than the big ones that we have today.
That's really interesting. So let's go from sour to another sweet thing that you have tried, which is actually quince jelly.
Yes, that's a very nice recipe as well. And of course, it's no coincidence that you latched on to this, because of course there is something very similar in contemporary Iberian cooking, the membrillo, which is a quince paste. The use of the quince is very interesting because when we have sweets today, we of course have modern technology and modern ingredients, things like gelatin and so on and so forth, which allow us to produce particular textures. Now here we have nature that actually is used in order to create the same effect. And so the quince is unique in that it is, well, it's one of very few fruits that has a very high pectin content. And so as a result, it's eminently suitable for preserves, jams, or here, jellies or paste. The Spanish, of course, I believe, is eaten with cheese. Correct me if I'm wrong. I've not personally had it, but so that's one thing that at least as far as the cookery books are concerned, that the Arabs didn't do. In terms of the preparation, here we have an interesting point. The modern quince pastes, or quince cheese as they're sometimes known, they require pulp. And in the medieval sources, they do have recipes that require the pulp, and so would have been very similar to a modern Spanish quince paste. But they felt that the one made just with the juice was more delicate, and so that was the one to be preferred. The other thing worth mentioning about this particular dish, this is one of those that I mentioned earlier, where it's not food as medicine, but medicine as food. And so this particular recipe is an addendum to this Andalusian cookery book to which I've referred from the 13th century. It's an addendum of medicinal preparations. And so this quince paste is one of them. But as I've said, it was, of course, made very sweet in order to make it palatable, enjoyable for somebody who was ill, but at the same time, it was also enjoyed by people who were in perfect health. And it really is quite a spectacular dish. And of course, quince, once you add the sugar, has a very nice flavor indeed.
Yeah, and this is a beautiful picture, so I just wanted to put it up there as you finish explaining about the quince. I'm gonna skip the next one, but because I want to talk about the other dish that I think is sort of a star dish. And it's actually a type of ravioli.
Yes, it's exactly like a ravioli. It's one of those dishes that has survived in similar form in many culinary cultures today. And it comes in different names. In English, you could also call it a dumpling, dumpling stuffed with meat. And for instance, the Russian pelmeni, which not only looks similar, but is also eaten with dairy, in their case, sour milk. But this particular recipe would require it to be eaten with yogurt. And so it's not only the stuffing, which is also meat, and the fact that it's encased in dough, but even the accompaniment has survived down through the ages. And I've got a bit of a surprise for you in that I can show you. I don't know whether you can see.
So let me show very quickly a close-up of this beautiful dish.
Okay.
And then I'm going to stop sharing. And we're just gonna stop sharing that. And so you can show me. Oh, you made it for us. So what's the filling of this ravioli?
Well, the filling is, as I said, very similar to the one that you would have today. The meat is lamb mince, and then you also have some parsley, some onion, mint, hazelnuts, almonds, saffron, a whole list of the usual spices that are added. And here, in terms of the spices, I've got another surprise for you, because there's two spices here that are quite exceptional. And the first one is spikenard. Now, spikenard is something that not a lot of people will have seen. It's a very old spice, already occurs in the Bible. It's a very aromatic spice. It's the root, actually, of a plant originally from the Indian subcontinent. Incidentally, it was also this spikenard that was used in the oil with which Mary Magdalene anointed the feet of Jesus. But it was used in cooking, and it was already used in antiquity. So the Roman cookery book by Apicius already contains some recipes requiring spikenard. And so here we have the spikenard. See if you can hold it up. So this is the dried form. And so it's actually pulled apart. And so you're left with something like this, which you can then pull apart and sprinkle on the required quantity. It's extremely fragrant and aromatic.
And where did
then the other exceptional one is a spice mix. In addition to, so there's the cuisine, as you will have gathered as you read the recipes, it goes extremely fragrant, extremely aromatic. And in addition to the ravioli, or the shish barak as it's known, which incidentally is still made in the Middle East, still a favorite, particularly in the Levant. You have, 10, 12, 15 spices. And in addition to that, you also have the spice mix, kind of the 13th century equivalent of the garam masala, if you like. And so here you see the spice that they called atraf et-tib, which is a collection of many spices. It's got nutmeg, mace, cardamom, cloves, rosebud, you name it. And so this is what it looks like in its powdered form. And here again, an unusual spice. This is long pepper. Very small. Member of the pepper family, of course. Here you have some basil, and then of course rose petals here. Just some of the ingredients. And so this is what the atraf et-tib, the spice mix, looks like. And it's exceptional in that this particular mix, you can use it in cooking, but you can use it in modern dishes too.
Right.
I put it on my eggs, for instance, and it works perfectly.
So where did you get these spices? And also the pepper, can we just quickly go back on the pepper? How, we do say that pepper was introduced from the New World. So where does this pepper come from?
This pepper was grown in the Far East.
That's how it came.
So there was already pepper there. It was, and of course, all the trading routes were plied by Arab merchants almost, before Islam even, but we have records as early as, say, the 9th century, where there were even Muslim communities in Guangzhou in China, or Canton as it used to be known, in Arabic Hanfu. And it was such a sizable community that they even had a representative who would deal with the Chinese emperor. And so there were well-established, well-trodden routes, and they would stop along different locations and then bring it back to the Arabian Peninsula, from where it would then go to other parts of the Muslim world and beyond, north, of course, to Al-Andalus. That was one route. And then another route north in Asia Minor, and as far north as the lands of the Slavs and the Russians and so on and so forth.
That's really fascinating. So where did you get these spices for you to consume in Northeast England?
Yes, well, that's an excellent question, and of course, it's all part of the journey. And many of these spices are spices that, as you say, you can't really just pick up from your corner shop. So if we talk about the unusual ones, whether it's things like long pepper or musk or ambergris or things like that, whenever I go to the Middle East, I spend a lot of time in spice markets, seeking out ingredients. And of course, fortunately, these days there's also the internet, and so it's possible to order things from further afield, but it's sometimes very difficult. And of course, the same goes even with tableware and kitchenware. If you looked at the blog, there too, an attempt is made to try and present it in a way that would have been recognizable to somebody from that time.
Yes, but hopefully, on that note, actually, thinking that perhaps soon again we'll be able to go to spice stores far away, seeking, ingredients that we can bring back home to try on these dishes. Let's finish today's conversation. We're way past the time that we were allowed, but this has been so fascinating. Thank you so much, Daniel. And thank you to our viewers for staying with us for this segment. And hopefully soon I will finally meet you, and perhaps I will be able to try some of the dishes.
Absolutely, absolutely. And thank you so much for having me. It was a real joy.
Thank you so much.